Good morning. My name is Michael Wilt. I am the host for On the House today. On the House is T-Shack's podcast. We typically cover home ownership stuff. That's how we start, at least. But we dive into other topics as well, and we have as of late. And this is a subject that is really going to cover everything, but we're focused on the multifamily side of things. And what we're talking about today is the legislative preview. And I'm joined by two very esteemed guests. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a second. But for those of you not familiar with the Texas legislature, we have a unique one that meets 5 months every 2 years, and they will gavel in January of 2025 and gavel out near the end of May. So there's a lot of work that has to get done in a very short amount of time. And housing has been an issue that session over session is garnering the attention of more and more policymakers. It's certainly affordability, housing affordability is an issue that primarily was impacting large urban areas, expensive places to live like Austin, and then it's crept into the Dallas and Fort Worth and Houston, and now into the small urban markets and rural areas as well. And so it's on the minds of legislators in every corner of the state. And we have a couple experts who are going to provide their perspective on things and encourage some banter among you all as you think about the answers to these questions and respond to them. But we're just going to get started. We'll get right into it. And I'm joined by Roger Arriaga and Todd Kercheval. So Todd, why don't we start with you, and you can just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you represent, your history at the Capitol. You've regaled us with some stories prior to starting this. It's really fascinating to hear about that. So I know you have a very distinguished tenure. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely, Michael. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Todd Kercheval, and I'm here today kind of as the executive director and representative for TALFA. That's our organization that our main membership is the HFCs across the state. But I do come with, I was just saying this 2025 will be my 26th year working in and around the legislative process. In addition to TALFA, I also am a hired gun lobbyist. I've represented the affordable housing industry since roughly about 2013. I have to kind of go back with my math a little bit. It was during TDHC's sunset bill, and they got into a little bit of trouble and decided they needed some help. And so it's been a wonderful relationship ever since then. I took them on as a client. Like a lot of lobbyists, you take on the client, you solve the problem, and you move forward. I really fell in love with the industry because I believe, just as a person, that everybody, regardless of where you sit on the socioeconomic scale, you deserve a place to live. It doesn't matter. A place to live is going to be a foundational part of whether or not you make it and have success in life. And so I really fell in love with the affordable housing industry and the people within the industry. And so we are just kind of plowing forward, and it's a real honor for me. A couple of years ago, TALFA gave me the opportunity to be their executive director and manage the association. So that's really been a great opportunity for us to dive a little bit deeper and kind of get our feet a little deeper into the water as really what the affordable housing industry means to the state of Texas.
Oh, thanks, Todd. There's this old movie about lobbying. It's probably not that old, 25 years, called "Thank You for Smoking." Have you seen that? And
That's a great movie.
and Aaron Eckhart, I think, is one of the actors in it, and he kind of describes what he does to his daughter, and he says that he's the Michael Jordan of talking. And if you all don't know Todd, Todd is a professional talker. He loves to talk, so forums like this are great for him to espouse on many things. But would you consider yourself a Michael Jordan of talking?
You know what? I don't know that I could ever put myself in the same category of Michael Jordan, but I aspire to be excellent at everything I do, and talking is a big part of what I do every day.
Exactly. All right, Roger, why don't you tell us about your time in and around the Capitol?
So I was just thinking about this recently, which is, by the way, I'm Roger Arriaga, and Michael, thanks for certainly inviting, because I think these issues, these discussions are important for others to understand what we actually deal with at the Capitol. That being said, I've been around housing for about 25 years, but in different capacities. I've done for-profit, I've done government, and I've done nonprofit. So I've seen kind of the gamut of how housing and affordable housing specifically is done in different formats. And what I learned as I was thinking about this is it doesn't matter what aspect of housing you're in, there is always going to be some aspect of the legislature you have to deal with, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit or government to that matter. You know, when I worked for the city of Austin, with their Austin Housing Finance Corporation years ago, one of the things we did was work in private activity bonds. And we had to also advise the city on various housing policies that were coming at the legislature. And so I've seen that aspect of it. And in the private sector, I used to do single family, I worked for a single family production builder for about 10 years, doing government relations work and other things with them. And one of my roles was to be at the legislature and watch what was going to be happening on single family policy and be prepared to speak on it whenever that came up. And then, of course, I've dealt with nonprofits in a variety of ways, the last of which is where I am now, which is executive director of the Texas Affiliation of Affordable Housing Providers. Been there in February, it'll be 7 years. And looking at that perspective, this perspective we have from the nonprofit advocacy side as a trade association, very different. You know, the issues are still the same, but it's different in the approach, is what I would say. So I've seen it in a variety of ways. The leadership changes as we're seeing right now with the Texas legislature, and you adjust what your expectations are and what your messaging is based on who the audience is. That's one of the big lessons I've learned.
Exactly. So you represent TAP and Todd, you Talfa. They're both housing-oriented organizations. You both explained a little bit who your members are. Maybe you can expand a little bit more on who your members are, Roger. And also, what is it? What does the lead up to the legislative session look like for TAP?
So I've learned this over the years in basically any trade association, because I've worked with home builders associations as well, and I've worked with chambers of commerce as well. And what I've learned is it's about relevance. You've got to have relevance in terms of what you do as an organization. So who is TAP? TAP is actually this month is 27 years old. So they've been around for just over 25 years. They cut their teeth on the low-income housing tax credit program. It was a group of developers back when that decided we needed more advocacy on this. They got together, created the organization, and here we are 27 years later, you know, kind of growing that perspective. But our members are, you know, I like to tell elected officials, our members are those who put affordable housing on the ground. They are not just the developers, but they are the bankers, and they're the attorneys and the accountants, you know, the syndicators, anybody that touches it either from a policy perspective or from you know, sticks and bricks, putting it on the ground perspective. Those are the folks that tend to be our members. And then there's a lot of policy that surrounds that as well. What I've often said is to be a good trade association, you really have to provide the members what they need, because they could just stop being members if they're not getting what they need, right? So for me, it's very important that we give them what they're looking for. Number one, are we giving them the latest and greatest in education so that they're aware of what's happening in the industry across the state or the country, depending what's happening? Number two, are we giving them opportunities to connect as businesses, because this is what they're in place for. It doesn't matter whether you're nonprofit or for profit. We invite everybody to TAP, but they need opportunities to connect with each other. So we work very hard to give them those opportunities. And third, they need to know that you have the ability to try to move the needle on affordable housing in an advocacy perspective. So we put all of our time and effort into kind of those three general categories, so that people want to stay and be a part of us, and that we can move the needle on affordability at the legislature and in Congress or in cities, wherever the place may be.
Absolutely. I think a good takeaway is the importance of being relevant at the Capitol. Your members have certainly done that, been a resource on housing issues in general. So credit to what you all are doing at TAP. How about Talfa? What does the lead into session look like for you guys?
So, like every session, you know, that we're kind of watching, making sure that the members of the legislature are educated as to what affordable housing is and what part Talfa plays in that, the HFCs. You know, it's where we're a little different than TAF. We're a little bit more narrowly focused. And so a lot of times we take a back seat and we watch and defend and kind of protect the industry. This session, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more, we've got an issue that's right at our doorstep. And so our prep for this session has really been working ahead of the legislative session starting, making sure that we started our education process many, many months ago, working in all facets of it, both with members, with our sister organization, our partners like TAP and other groups, to make sure that as this issue goes forward through the legislature, and it's the cross-jurisdictional issue that we'll talk about in a little while, that we make sure that everybody understands this is about us. This is about the organizations that make up Talfa, and we will be happy to and insist on taking the lead to make sure we can work this through the process. And so that's what this session The lead up to this session has really been like for Talfa. We've got a wonderful engagement. This has been a good thing for us. We've got folks who traditionally maybe wouldn't have been engaged in the legislative process that are very engaged. And so that's what we've really been focusing a lot of time on for the last several months.
You know, I want to focus on something Todd just said, the education aspect, right? I've mentioned it, he's mentioned it, it's common. But if you think about what's happening in the upcoming legislature, I don't know if this is something you want to talk about later, but there's going to be 35 new elected officials starting. What does that mean for us? How they get elected, that's up to them. We don't participate in that aspect. But now that they are there, and now that we know what we want to get accomplished in terms of housing, education is it. These are people that know little to nothing, in most instances, about housing, much less affordable housing and the complexities that go with that. So a lot of the time and effort that TALFA will spend and TAP will spend and other advocacy organizations will spend is like just the basics. Here's what you need, new freshman representative, to know about what the state of Texas does in affordable housing, the programs that they put in place, how they work, and here are the different aspects that you may get questions on. So I know Todd does very good at this. We do our best as well, which is to be a resource for them so that they at least have some workable conversational knowledge on when these issues hit. Here's what they should understand.
Okay. That's a great perspective, Roger. Thank you for elaborating on that. I wanted to get into some of the priorities your organizations have identified, and we're going to leave that for a little bit later because we're going to kind of go through some of these issues one by one, and we'll probably hit some of the priorities that you all are both interested in. And if there's something we missed after we wrap up kind of what the legislature's focused on and maybe some of these issues, then we'll provide some time for that to cover some issues we may have missed. But let's start with the leadership, right? Because they're the driving force between what's going to get accomplished and what the priorities are going to be for the legislature. And between the speaker, lieutenant governor, you've got the committee chairs, and certainly Comptroller Hager, who has been a leading voice in sounding the alarm bells that we're going to lose our competitive advantage if we don't address our housing affordability issue. Between all these leadership voices of the Capitol, do you think that there will be some consensus on a few housing policies that everyone will align behind to try and pass?
It's funny because I read the comptroller's report shortly after it came out, and I thought, wait a minute, I don't remember writing this, but it seemed a lot of things that I've been saying lately, because those messages were resoundingly familiar to not just me, but to our members and anybody in the industry. It comes down to the lack of supply at the end of the day, and that's fully acknowledged. So in terms of leadership, I will tell you one thing. Now, I have been around housing for a long time, maybe not around the legislature as long, even though they've all dabbled in legislative stuff. But I will tell you, I have not seen this level of attention on affordable housing in a long time, and at the legislative level. We always raise it. It's always part of our messaging. But in this instance, there are the Senate and the House both issued interim charges dealing with affordable housing. We're lucky to ever get one or maybe half of a charge where they might talk about affordable housing. This time it's fully in full view. Now, why is that important? Because if it's in an interim charge, that's a good lead into the expectation that there may be legislation to follow that ultimately may be supported by a committee or by the lieutenant governor or the speaker. So from leadership's perspective, I'm encouraged. I like that they're having the discussion. Now, how they have that discussion is up to organizations like Todd's and ours about what are those messages, what are the key issues how do we drive that discussion, since it's in a broad sense kind of laid on the table for us to discuss.
Sure. I think I just want to poke Roger a little bit and for fun, but I also do believe that we have a serious thing we need to make sure we understand. Affordable housing is being talked about through housing affordability. And those are two different things. Yeah. Those are two very different things. Housing affordability speaks to the increased insurance costs, the increased property taxes, the impact that home ownership has on every Texan out there. I think the affordable housing industry has gotten excited because we're hearing some familiar words. And I think we have to be careful and look historically back. When the legislature starts talking about affordable housing, we start talking about being pretty defensive. And there have been some positive bills passed in the last few sessions that have helped out. But at the same time, name me a session in the last 10, 15 years where we haven't had to be on defense because the need, there's not a question that there's a lack of inventory of affordable housing in the state of Texas. You've got a growing population, growing faster than any other state in the United States. But then when the policy discussion of affordable housing starts to take hold, or at the municipal level, when you've got a community that needs affordable housing, and yet the city council members don't want to approve that because of their fear of who actually lives in affordable housing, which in the state of Texas is completely unfounded because it is supplying our workforce a place to live in most cases. I think we have to be very vigilant. So as we walk into this next legislative session, and this is just my 26 years of a diverse subject matter, I walk in not, oh, look, we're walking into open arms. I view it as, what are you going to think? Because what members of the legislature talk about during the interim don't always translate into the same positive message when we start talking about the black and white of the code and how that code's going to affect the industry.
Todd, I 100% agree with you. One of the things that I've noticed, and maybe you've seen the same, is that as the legislature is talking about housing and they are kind of interplaying housing affordability with affordable housing, I agree with you. It does raise kind of our ears and our eyebrows about like, oh, wow, they're actually saying these things, which is great. But I do fully acknowledge that their premise tends to be in single family housing and home ownership. We get that. My argument has always been if affordability and affordable housing if you're going to get there, it's ultimately a supply issue. But I have always argued it's all of it. We need multifamily, we need single family. And one of the dynamics that I've seen, and I hope to communicate this to our legislators, is that, and I've heard legislators say, hey, Texas economy is doing great. It's been doing great. It's been doing better than most for a long, long time. That's wonderful. But I've I've always seen that there's kind of a binding constraint. And what I mean by that is there's a limit to that in terms of who's moving here, taking jobs, and that binding constraint is the availability of housing for them to live in a decent, affordable way. And I just saw an article this week, as a matter of fact, that annual kind of U-Haul measures who's in migrating to the state versus, and for the first time, they said Texas is neutral for the most part. By and large, there's been more people coming than leaving, but they're kind of like starting to see a little bit of that waning, I guess. And in my mind, that struck as, well, maybe it's a housing issue because why would people not move here if it's all working? You've got a good job, you need a good house or a good apartment to do so. You lump that into the fact that the lack of supply, both in multifamily and single family, is the fact that in the single family world, it is hard to find for a first time home buyer. What is that? Nowadays, it's $350,000 for a first time home. If you don't have any kind of down payment assistance, conventionally you need at least 5% down, which means who's walking around with about $15,000 or $20,000 in their pocket? Not many. What does that mean? It means that they're having to stay in rental situations. But meanwhile, while that rental situation, whether it's a duplex, fourplex, or a multifamily, they're all leased up. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the owners can raise their rates because everybody wants in. Because why? Those that would otherwise love to own a home can't own a home. And that gulf between those families ready to own and the number of available single family homes, it's getting bigger. So there's this tightening, not a tightening, it is a supply issue, harder to move from rental to ownership for those that want it. And that ownership mantra is not changing. So I agree with you, Todd. The discussion in my mind is going to start on single family. I think it's up to organizations like ours to morph that discussion to say, but yes, in the meanwhile, how do you get these families to have disposable income? Is by giving them those affordable opportunities where they can afford rent and it's not taking up 50, 60, or 70% of their income, but they're able to put a little money aside to get to that first time homeowner opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah, to your point, Todd, words matter, right? When we're talking about affordable housing, you have to understand, is the member concerned or talking about affordable housing as a product, or are they talking about housing affordability in general, right? Because those can be two very distinct things.
I agree.
But, to your point, Roger, when we talk about housing policies in general, that especially that encourage the production of housing, whether you're in the income restricted housing space or not, everybody's in pretty much universal agreement that we need more housing on the ground, and that will benefit everybody. I there was this book that came out about 5 years ago about the rise of the Yes in My Backyard movement in San Francisco, and all these people as part of that movement were testifying for these Class A multifamily developments in front of the board of supervisors, and a lot of people were saying, well, why do you care about the luxury apartments and luxury condos? And it's to your point, Roger, they care about having more product on the ground, knowing that that will help alleviate the crisis across all the product types,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
And I work a lot in the homelessness space and the permanent supportive housing space, and people always say, well, what's the right housing intervention for homelessness? And I'm like, every intervention. We need it all, right? There is no magic silver bullet that's going to solve the affordability crisis from a product delivery standpoint. We need more and more of it across the board. And that's kind of a good lead in into this Senate local government hearing that we had in November that Chairman Betancourt presided over. There were some themes that definitely emerged among the legislators and people testifying. And I want to go through some of those themes, the ones that really stuck out. And I'd like to understand from you if you think the legislature will address any of these. And let's start with the supply issue, because that's what we've been talking. We were just talking about that, and almost everyone agreed, whether you're a legislator or somebody testifying, that limited housing supply is a culprit for our state's housing affordability challenges. Do you foresee any legislative interventions to increase the supply of housing, and what would those look like?
I think it's really this discussion we just had, which is I think it's going to start, as Todd suggested, in the single family space. Why? Because more often than not, our elected officials understand that world. They pay mortgages, they pay insurance, they are seeing those relative cost increases. So it will ultimately start, in my mind, how can we get more people to own homes? I think the challenge is going to be for organizations like TAP and TALFA and others that represent and advocate for multifamily affordability to morph that into the broader discussion to say, you know what? We agree with you, legislature, that we would love to have more single family ownership, but you can't get there until you have options now to get people to have this extra disposable income with affordability. And that's going to require some level of rental or multifamily experience where they have that opportunity.
Sure.
I think the legislature's going to look at the inventory issue. I think they are going to look at it from a single family perspective. I think you've got other organizations like the Texas Association of Builders that are going to be in their ear. It's a wonderful organization, by the way, that has a division that focuses on affordable housing. We work closely with, and I think they're going to look at a lot of what restrictions are happening on a local level that could be, whether it's zoning, whether it's some of the standards, cost, our local ordinances, preventing development. I think they're going to look a lot at that. I think that speaks to this conversation that's been ongoing at the legislature for the last couple of sessions about local authorities. I think the preemption bill that they passed to say, hey, you can't trump state law. You can't supersede state law when it comes to extra requirements on services and things like that. So I think they're going to look at some of those different things that could be preventing some of that growth. But at the same time, I think they balance that. If you go to Williamson County, drive down Highway 29 West, it's new development after new development after new development. So I think they're going to balance, why is it growing in one area and not in the other? And I think that's really that's where their focus will kind of be. Because I think some of it they can control. And I think there's some things that state law just simply can't. They're probably not going to pass a bill that says you can't charge more than X per square foot of development. So I think there's a number of factors that go into it that they will take a swing at and try to bring some solution to. I don't think there will be a silver bullet, though, come out of this legislature. I don't think the legislature can produce a silver bullet that addresses some of those problems.
Yeah, housing's too complicated for one answer.
No, it's way too complicated.
I thought it was complicated for a long time too. And then at the end of the day, I feel like that there are only 4 factors that affect the cost of a house. And I usually refer to them as the 4 L's, and that's land, labor, lumber being the collective term for all the materials that you use, and then laws, the regulatory environment that surrounds the production of a house. And if you can intervene in any one of those levers and bring down the cost a little bit, I think that's where you can have the biggest bang for your policy buck, if you will.
Yeah.
You mentioned Highway 29, Williamson County, and I never really thought about a legislator or a policymaker taking cues from what's happening in one part of the state, especially when it comes to housing development. But that's a pretty fascinating take if they were to look at, well, what are they doing in Williamson County that's allowing them to just greenlight all these housing developments so quickly? Todd, you touched on the land use restrictions, zoning restrictions. I think if you're a developer, no matter if you're single family or multifamily, you're all dealing with kind of the regulatory environment that's on top of you that not only causes you limitations in what you can build, but also can make the process a very timely one. And that was definitely the second overarching theme that came out of this hearing. And this is actually where the legislature can get involved, right? On some land use restrictions, some zoning restrictions that are done on the municipal level. And do you think that the legislature will continue to build upon this from kind of, they got into this last session? Do you foresee that they're going to build upon this more?
I think they will. I think it's something that, the legislature is in some ways completely difficult to try to discern what they're going to do. And then in some ways it's very simple. What they talk about over an extended amount of time traditionally comes to fruition with some type of idea or potential solution. I think they've talked about this. I think land use zoning has been a hot topic for a number of years, I think across a number of different industries. I mean, go to Houston, which is zoning, without, and look at the billboard industry. I mean, land use has been a fight that the legislature is very, very familiar with. And I think it's now in the backyards of housing. And so I do think, one, I think they feel like they've got some experience with it. And two, I think they recognize it is a legitimate problem within the housing community and that they can actually wield their pen to help ease the burden just a little bit.
And it kind of philosophically aligns with certainly the leadership and a lot of the members there that property owners should have a little bit more flexibility with what they want to do on their own land and what they want to build.
I agree, Michael. And I think that it's important to always remember we're Texas.
Exactly.
Property ownership, property rights in Texas, we believe is an almighty grant. We got that. It's a birthright. It's given at a higher level than if you go to even other property states. We just view property ownership in the state of Texas as something that it's our end all be all. It's our piece of the land and we're entitled to it. And so I think that really fits into the leadership of the legislature right now. And if you look kind of across multiple industries where they're really pushing towards the side of, this is your property right, land ownership, and you should have some say so. We're not going to let somebody to take your right away in determining what happens with your land.
Absolutely. Roger, any expansion on that? The land use restrictions, zoning restrictions, easing up some of those?
Todd mentioned this, and I fully agree with it, which is if there is any chance to address housing on a broad basis, it's going to be through land use reforms and zoning and those sorts of things. So it's really going to be the legislature telling local governments, we want more of this. Go make sure that your laws are flexible to allow it to happen. So I do think that any bill that comes out that's going to talk about how to require flex local government regulations, I think those bills will have a real strong chance because, like Todd said, because they're familiar with it. They understand what that results in. And in their minds, they could see the real tangible benefits of having that in a single family world first, but ultimately some of that will bleed into multifamily as well.
We're going to start with you on this next one too, because it's about insurance. And I know that's top of mind, not only for homeowners, but especially for multifamily developers and property managers. I heard it mentioned with some of the testimony that one of your members provided at that hearing. And look, we're all dealing with skyrocketing insurance rates. And is there something the legislature can do to meaningfully address this?
I break my head on this concept every day. Here's my take, and Todd, you may have a different perspective. The insurance issue is hurting everybody. It's hitting everybody: homeowners, renters, automobile salespeople, anybody that has a facility or some business where insurance is a part of it, and it's a growing part of it, then it affects everybody to that degree. What I like to argue, though, is that in the multifamily and affordable multifamily world specifically, it's really having an acute impact. And I say the insurance issues have an acute impact because in our worlds with housing tax credits or private activity bond finance developments, you don't have the ability to just move up your rents. If you're a private market developer and suddenly any of your costs increase, well, you go and say, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to raise your rent to pay for this extra cost. We don't have that ability in this world because we're capped. That's part of the program. We provide you great, high quality, affordable developments, and we're going to keep your rent as limited as possible according to what the feds allow us to do. And so with that, you have skyrocketing costs. I've had developers tell me that over the last 5 years, they have seen insurance rates, not just double-digit increases, triple-digit increases. Now, here's the difference with that, or the key things that I like to look at. Number one, what does that mean? For new developments. For new developments, when you're penciling a deal, you're going to have to put in a lot more for insurance based on what you think you know today, but you may not know for tomorrow, so you're guessing. And the bigger impact in my mind is for those developments that have been on the ground for a long time. Their pro formas had never anticipated this level of an increase. And so suddenly it's an operational cost that now they've got to figure out because they never thought it would get to this level. They kind of anticipated nominal increases, but not this level that we're seeing. So what does that mean for them? It means that they're having to cut staff, reduce staff, defer more maintenance. So it doesn't help the affordable housing space at all. And I'll add one more thing, and that is if it gets to the point, and I don't mean this just with insurance, but insurance is a big problem. If at any point an existing affordable housing tax credit development gets to the point where, hey, I just can't keep my doors open because of these costs and my limited ability to charge rents, if they go to foreclosure, the foreclosure process strips all the affordability requirements away. And in that situation, what good was all this investment from the state of Texas or the federal government to say you must provide these housing units with these affordability requirements if ultimately it'll get stripped away because of an economic issue happening with things like insurance? So it is a big issue for us. On the grand scheme of things, affordable housing is a small, tiny piece of that concern. In our world, it's a big deal because we feel that we're housing the workforce of Texas. And if suddenly it becomes at risk, having these developments is at risk, and you're having fewer developments happen on the new side, and some developments existing that are really constrained that are already on the ground operationally, this could cause a real cliff for affordable housing developers, owners, property managers, et cetera. So that's why we're ultra concerned about what the insurance impacts. I don't say it's the industry, it's the impacts. And that if it gets any worse than it is, it's getting to a point where it's more acute and could put developers, new developments and existing developments at risk.
Sure. Thank you, Roger. Todd, can they do anything about insurance?
That's a great question. I was visiting with a new member, and I don't want to out who it is here. It's not that it's a secret. And they come out of the insurance world, and they were explaining to me that he believes there actually is some things that they can do. He got into explaining there's only 7 reinsurers and immediately was in over my head at that. So I think there's going to be some effort out there. I do think there are some things. Insurance is one of those things. It's a career type of subject matter, and I don't have the basis for it. I do think one of the best things we have going for us is it's impacting every home. Yeah. Every property owner in the state of Texas is being impacted, whether it's affordable or otherwise. And so I think that's going to be advantageous for us. I think that the state has to be careful in that, I was chief of staff of appropriations at one time in the legislature. And it's a balancing act of how the state can help versus how the state creates an ongoing financial burden that they have to deal with. Right now, the state of Texas is ripping and roaring, doing great. Most people will forget that back in 2009, had it not been for some federal dollars that came to the state of Texas, we were $10 billion in the hole. So I think the challenge that the state has is if they can enact some relief on the insurance issue, they have to be careful not to make it a financial burden long term for the state of Texas. Because to help out until you can't help out only falls back onto the homeowner or the property owner, that now they probably have a bigger problem than they had before. So I think it's a very touchy thing. I'm excited to see what bills get filed because it is something that I want to learn a little bit more about and understand where that market is. I think on a larger scale, I think the insurance industry probably has some scrutiny coming because this is happening across the country. You've got places like Florida that insurance companies are pulling completely out of, and you've got a very limited, you know, group of suppliers of insurance at that point in time. I think that this is going to really bubble over. I think the next administration's got this on their plate that they have to deal with, and it's going to be interesting to see what comes out of it. I really believe at the federal level they're going to look at it because changes across the country are going to need to be implemented.
Absolutely.
I want to emphasize that with what Todd just said. We talk about the insurance issue as it applies to Texas and as it applies to housing. It is a national issue. And one of the things that I've seen is that I see different pockets of initiatives in different parts of the country because, the Gulf Coast states have a very unique issue. But we also see that, fires and earthquakes and other things that are proliferating are starting to impact as well. So the markets are all different. People in El Paso don't have nearly the issues as people in Houston or Galveston do in terms of insurance rates. But all that is coming to bear. And I would love to see something happen in Texas. And every time I've raised that issue with those that are experts in the area, and I'm not an expert in this like Todd, I play one on TV. It's about as good as I can do. But they tend to mention the issue of, well, if you're going to fix insurance, you got to fix or get back into tort reform, which is a whole other ball of wax that is related, but not directly with insurance alone. And I think that fear, Todd, that's what worries me, is that if there's a perspective or a perception at the legislature that if we're going to fix insurance, I got to get into tort reform, that may scare enough legislators away to say, let's kick this down the road and let the feds handle it.
Having been at the Capitol when
During
they did
tort reform.
the first time,
Right.
Roger, we're going to cut your microphone off if you don't talk about that, okay? Don't give anybody any ideas.
Oh man. Yeah, you just PTSD triggers,
Yeah.
Roger. Well, the next issue is something that is uniquely Texas, and it is something that the legislature can intervene in, and that's property taxes. This issue was front and center last session, and definitely made a lot of progress on this. Do you feel like legislators said, "All right, we addressed this last session, and there's it's not going to be front and center this session again"?
I think it'll be front and center again.
Okay.
Property tax, it's a touchy thing. There's all these different plans to buy down property tax. They went with raising the homestead exemption last time. So I think it went from 75,000 up to 100,000, which was great in a lot of ways. And my comments aren't a criticism of how they did it because I think they take a great swing at it, and I think they hit a home run for a lot of people. But when you take the homestead exemption in a small rural community, and I think we have to remember that though there's more members in the legislature that represent Harris County than the wide side of the state, we still have to recognize the impacts of state policy on rural Texas. So when you look at a lot of these smaller rural communities and you take that homestead exemption up to 100,000, there's not a ton of homes that are valued over 100,000. Sure, in some areas there are, but there's a lot of places that are not. So I think that property tax revenue that was on the tax rolls went away. So I think they have to look at that. I think if they raise the homestead exemption again, that's a great immediate relief for all of us that live either in Travis Williamson or Bexar County. Yeah, raise it to 300,000, please. Thank you. But at the end of the day, I live in Williamson County. My property taxes, they pace far ahead of whatever exemption the legislature gives. And so they get into the deal, are we gonna start taking the free market and putting a government hand on it, saying you can't raise values above a certain point? It's really a tough situation. In my own home, just based on property taxes, it's incredibly expensive, expensive. And I think when you start looking at that as well, we've got an aging population, but with an aging population, we have population loss. So if you think about that category of people that their property taxes were frozen at age 65, yeah, well, you've got more coming into that. You've got others leaving, the cost of insurance, property taxes. I mean, at some point, the state has to look and go, wait a minute, the homestead exemption is not going to be enough. I think Governor Patrick, the Lieutenant Governor, I think Senator Betancourt are really committed to property tax relief in the state of Texas. I don't think that their accomplishment last session was the goal line. I think it was just a benchmark on the path. So I really expect to see Senator Betancourt fully engaged, along with Lieutenant Governor Patrick, in property tax relief for the state of Texas.
I would fully agree with that. As I was thinking about where we might go on property taxes, there's no downside for the legislature looking at it. They had some success. I think they'll work on building even more this coming session. And if you think about it, these property tax rates based on valuations, based on your home's value or your multifamily market rate value, and the demand on the need for more supply. Well, when there's less supply, there's higher value. So again, that goes back to the argument of ultimately the long-term solution is going to be let's get more supply on the ground to even out the demand and ultimately the values, and maybe that's a long-term form of tax relief, but immediately.
But here's what I would say. Yeah, I agree with that. But then I have the question, let's go back to Williamson County.
Yeah.
How can you put hundreds and hundreds of new rooftops up every year? Major commercial development happening as well. And yet you're taking the existing property taxes and just skyrocketing them. I think there's abuse in the appraisal system. I think that's the revenue source for these local governments, a large revenue source for these local governments. And I think they're going to take as much as they can. And I don't make that comment as derogatory as it sounds, but I think at some point we have to look at the funding structure of local government. At some point, and don't anybody turn the radio off when you hear me say this, at some point the legislature is going to have to look at the existing tax structure within the state of Texas. I think that there's plenty of examples that we don't want to go to a income tax system. I think one of the reasons Texas has grown the way it has, Texas, Wyoming, these income tax free states have grown the way they have, is because it's not necessarily the best system possible. There was a theory back in the old days that there's no better tax than an old tax. So do they visit sales tax? What are some of the different things that they can look at? As a larger, I understand that no news taxes has cost people presidencies in the past. But I think at some point, the stewards of the state at that time are going to have to review where our tax code is and how can tweaks be made to it to maybe stop some of the pain.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's a policy discussion surrounding who is best equipped to provide the state revenue.
Correct.
Because every state has to have revenue. And you look at your revenue generating sources, and yes, the vast majority of states have income tax as a large revenue generating source. We banned that in our constitution. So that's not on the table. And so then you look at other revenue generating streams. And 20 years ago, it was let's increase the sin taxes as much as we can on cigarettes and everything else, because policy decision, right? You are electing to do this harmful activity, you should pay more.
You should pay more.
So it's a fascinating discussion about who bears the burden of providing the state revenue and what does that look like. And yes, I agree with you both. Property taxes will be back this session. Maybe not front and center like it was last session, but certainly a big topic. So we're talking about this hearing that happened in November. Chairman Betancourt, he opened it up by, I thought this was really curious, talking about opportunities for adaptive reuse of of empty office buildings. And this conversation started around COVID, whenever people were working from home. We had these empty office buildings downtown, and people said, "Oh, and we had a housing shortage." And in conjunction, we always have a housing shortage, but then people thought, well, hey, why can't we just convert office space into residential? And then architects would say, or engineers would say, well, office buildings are built a little bit different than multifamily. Yeah, the shell may look the same, but all the insides, you have to completely redo it. And so I just want to know real quickly from both of y'all if you think the legislature could do anything to encourage adaptive reuse.
My perspective is I think they will encourage it. I'm hearing this issue on adaptive reuse in a variety of different arenas. So people are thinking about it. And of course the commercial real estate owners, they want to know what is my asset? What can it be if it's not being used right now downtowns across the state? Here's the consistent thing that I've heard from our members on this. Isn't that it's impossible. It's just that it's extremely expensive if you want to convert a standard office building into a standard kind of condo regime or multifamily setup that is designed for that purpose. And a lot of it, from what I understand, has to do with the systems in that existing commercial structure, which is how is water distributed? How is electricity distributed? How does the foundation stand for, adding, the insides of a building can always be structured to create bedrooms and bathrooms and studies and things like that, except that how you deal with those systems is very unique. I talked to an engineer not long ago that said, hey, we can definitely use adaptive reuse, but it's going to change, it's going to require a total different mindset from the people that live there. And I was like, what do you mean by that? Well, if you're okay with, dorm style community bathrooms, or if you're okay with community kitchens, those things, and we can create bedrooms all day long in these structures, but it's those things that if you can change your mind and know that you might see your next door neighbor using a kitchen the next morning with you, or maybe there's, I don't know how they would design it, maybe one per floor, or that you'd have to go down the hall for a bathroom break. Those sorts of things that if we're able to change mindsets, we could do it all day long. But if you're thinking about the standard condo regime where it is your space and everything is incorporated, that is where there's kind of a standstill on how do we make this happen without some significant investment that would need to occur.
Communal living, that might have been a good place for long-haired Todd to live back in the day, as we discovered before we started recording this.
I think to Roger's point, I think we talked about how complex housing can be.
Well, here's the one part about housing that's very simple. It's nothing more than a math equation. Housing is a math equation. I have to spend this much and get this much back. I think when you start talking about, I love the concept. I love out of the box thinking. I think that's how we come up with some of our best ideas. But I think when you talk about adaptive reuse in certain situations, the affordable housing industry has shown there's been old churches turned into amazing affordable housing opportunities. And so I think that it is certainly a conversation that needs to continue to happen. I think it's probably on a very specific level. I think there's a very specific framework that will work. And I think when you bring the people to the table who have to pay for it and then try to get the rents, I don't think communal living is going to take off. I don't think it is. I think it's a great conversation piece, but I think that we need to put some more options on the menu to try to address the real issue out there, the inventory.
I would agree with that. It's one thing to convert an old hotel into, SRO, single room occupancies, or some other aspect of that. It's another thing to take a standard office building, that has, floors and it's set up for cubicles and creating bedroom spaces, kitchen spaces, bathroom spaces in a way that makes sense without some significant investment.
Yeah, at a hotel, you've got bathrooms in every room, sometimes kitchenettes, and that's really where the pain points are.
Agreed.
Private activity bond program. Your members are both interested in this. Last time we had significant changes to this was 6 years ago, 3 sessions ago. with Chairman Lucio at the time. Do you all foresee any changes to this program? Any big changes?
That was a good bill then. I remember because our organizations worked together on putting that together.
It was a wonderful bill and championed through and fostered through the process by the former executive director, Gene Tallarico, who was a champion of affordable housing for Talfa for many, many years. From the Talfa standpoint, we're really singularly focused on making sure that 394 doesn't get completely cut up over these traveling HFCs. Certainly, we're going to watch it. Our group thinks that the bond program is okay right now, functioning. Are there things that could be done to make it better? Possibly, but it's one of those things that they're very careful about opening up the code, not out of fear of it getting loose, but making sure that they don't reactively push something or change something that the truth of the matter is maybe the market is going to change and that's going to help it. So from the private activity bond program this session, we'll certainly watch and monitor, but we'd kind of like to see it stay as it is right now and really focus in on educating about affordable housing and protecting our HFCs across the state.
Same with TAP. I mean, we want to protect every tool in the toolbox. We don't want to see it getting in a place where it's not going to be helpful. So we're going to watch and we'll participate to support or oppose anything that will come out and damage the program as a whole.
Great. Got a couple more rapid fire questions, and we're going to dive into a couple policies that I know are front and center for your members. Anything substantive to address homelessness that you all are hearing about?
One of my very first jobs in housing, I worked for, this would be back in 97, 98, back under Kirk Watson's first term as mayor. I got to work for him, fortunately. I learned a lot of stuff, but he assigned me to work on homelessness issues back then. And I learned then, and I still see the same dynamics. It is a service-intensive requirement if you really want to deal with this substantively. And so it's making sure there's a good amount of money available for services, but also the structures, the facilities to do so. And so my thought is, I don't think we're going to see anything substantive out of the legislature, because it would right now what is attributed to local governments and the state government is federal pass-through monies by and large, and whatever cities are willing to contribute to that. So in my mind, I don't think that's going to change this coming session. I think they would like to see more efficient uses of it to the degree that they can. They are acknowledging that it's an issue. They would like to see it resolved, but I think, Todd, maybe you have a perspective on this, that they see this as a local issue more than anything else.
I think so too. I think it is. I think it is a local issue. I think it's a massive local issue. I think it's a massive issue across the board. It has statewide impacts. I think it's probably, I mean, if I can be mildly political, I think it's a little bit more of a D issue than an R issue on a statewide level. I think that, it's probably not going to get the attention that it deserves. But at the same time, I think the local municipalities, the local jurisdictions and governments need to really look at. I think Austin is doing some things. I hear on the news about some of the hotels or those types of things that they look at. But I think homelessness is a larger topic than just where do we house them. I think it's a mental health issue. I think it's a pretty big topic that I would like to think that at some point we could put politics aside and put humanity on the, in front and center and really try to start dealing with that issue. But I don't think it's going to get the attention this session that probably it should.
Sure. And then lastly, do you anticipate any increased state funding for housing in general, or any new revenue streams for housing that are created by the state?
They passed that state housing tax credit program last session with limited funding in it. I think there'll be an effort to go after some more funding in that. I think we've got a huge water infrastructure initiative. I think the need is at $5 billion. I think the legislature is stacking hands on about $3 billion. Do I think there's a chance? I absolutely think there's a chance. I think that there is still a lot of educating that has to happen. To Roger's point at the beginning of this, we've got a lot of brand new members. And there's a lot going on in the legislature right now that we'll talk about before this is over that is probably going to be more politically centered and not policy centered. And so I think we're going to have to work really hard to get any additional funding for the affordable housing industry out of this legislative session. But I think it's also important for everybody in the industry to remember that discouragement is your biggest enemy. When you ask for financial support from the Texas legislature, understand that you are walking down a multi-year road process, and that every year we go through, even if no is the answer, we still made a lot of good headway on educating about the need. And so I think eventually we get there. I don't think we get to where we want to be in the 89th legislative session.
Todd brings up a fascinating point about this kind of slow walk, and we have a legislature. Like I opened this by saying that only meets 5 months every 2 years. So you have a limited window to do anything, and really within those 5 months, everything gets done in the last 2.5 months.
Yeah.
And so we're talking less than 3 months of intense legislative activity over a 2 year period. And within that, you're hoping that you can make some incremental, unless your issue is identified as a priority, you're hoping that you can just make some incremental progress. Like, I got it out of committee. Well, we might be high-fiving for getting out of committee, right? Thinking that you never had a chance to even get a hearing. And then maybe you get it to the House floor, the Senate floor, and then you get it out of one of the chambers. And then you high-five over that. And 8, 10 years later, you may finally pass a bill. And it is a slow walk on a lot of those things. And that happened with the state housing tax credit bill. And Roger, we're gonna talk about that next, because Craig Goldman had that bill filed session after session after session. I think it passed. It passed last session. That was probably the fourth session that it had been filed. So I know that was an important bill for TAP and your members. And do you think the state's going to build upon the success of that state housing tax credit bill?
We really hope so. Like Todd mentioned, it was passed last session. We were very excited about it. The funding that went with it wasn't what we were hoping for. But you know what? We took a big victory lap on the fact that we have it now. This is actually state investment. This is state funds for the intention of matching what is happening with the federal tax credit, now adding a state tax credit. That's important because it's an extra source of revenue that the state gets to decide how it spends at the end of the day.
How much is it?
25 million over 8 or 9 years, I want to say. So
Okay.
If you look at it, it's not a whole lot, not enough to really move the needle. What TDHCA did, the state agency, and I think they were looking at, well, what would be a viable use for these funds that we do have, and they use it as an incentive to do very low income support, and I think that's just fine. The only downside that I see is that as the legislature this session is looking, and people are recommending, hey, let's go put some more substantive funding into the state tax credit. If I'm in their shoes, the first question I'm going to ask is, well, what did you do with the last set of money? And what they're going to be able to say is, because I think they just recently allocated those dollars, and so they're not really going to be on the ground for a while. And what they will say is, well, we have funded, a number of developments for low income, very low income support. All good. But then they're going to ask us, well, what would you do with, 5 times that? If we put in 30 million or 40 million or 50 million, what would that do? What would you do? And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. There's probably 25 other states that have a state income, a state tax credit. And they are much more substantively funded. Much smaller states than ours are substantively funding it because that's how they're doing it in their state. We would like to replicate that here in Texas to say, if you want to give an investment to affordable housing in Texas, that process is a good way to use it. It lets the state agency decide how it ultimately will be applied. They could decide we want to put it all to rural developments, or they might want to assist veterans, or they might want to do any number of things, and it's their opportunity to do so. So we see a lot of opportunity. We will support any bill that says bring us more money to the state tax credit.
Absolutely. And these bills tend to have a lot of bipartisan support on the federal and state level, right? Because Republicans love it because it's a tax reduction at the end of the day. You have less tax liability, and Democrats love it because it's addressing a social need. So
Absolutely.
It's kind of a win-win for legislators. Todd, you've touched upon traveling HFCs. I want to dive into that. For people that aren't familiar with this issue of traveling HFCs, maybe you can start there. I actually read an article about it yesterday on MSN.com. It's definitely getting a lot more attention in the non-housing world because of how it's affecting tax revenues, right? for taxing jurisdictions. Talk about what this issue is and why the legislature's interested in it.
So the traveling HFCs, you've got an HFC and think about they're in their jurisdiction, which just for the ease of this is think about the county boundaries. Okay. And so you've got the county boundaries that are there, but Now, there is an Attorney General opinion request out there that says, is this legal or not legal? But right now, that people think it's legal, and you could have an HFC from one county go and do a development in another county and
I'm going to
remove.
interrupt you real quick because um, maybe talk about what an HFC is, the Housing Finance Corporation, how they typically operate, where they operate, and
So an HFC works in partnership with a developer in their local area to create affordable housing opportunities. And so the HFCs, which have been around, that law was passed in 1979 and have been one of the most successful programs in the state of Texas for making sure that affordable housing gets on the ground in those local areas. A few years ago, and there's been some examples where an HFC would step outside of its jurisdiction in an area that could not provide, for whatever reason, a partner for a developer to create affordable housing, either through ground up development or some type of acquisition program. And so there it has been done where they've worked out of their jurisdiction, but that's also in those cases have been done with full disclosure to the jurisdiction in which they're going to. So no understanding that property is going to come off the tax roll. The problem happened when a couple of, and I don't want to say outlaw, Michael, but a couple of HFCs have taken advantage of the vagueness of the law. And they've gone and worked with developers outside of the jurisdiction. And a lot of this has been acquisition, and acquisition development is an extremely important part of inventory for the affordable housing industry. So I don't want to villainize acquisition development, but in this instance, it's taking a market rate development that's on the ground, probably, has been there a few years, rolling that into an affordable housing program with a partner, an HFC and a developer partner. That removes that from the tax roll. The problem in this instance is that's being done without notification or cooperation with that local entity. In a lot of places in the state, realistically, property tax is important everywhere. It's more important in places that the majority of their property tax revenue is derived from multifamily developments. And so you've got some places in the state of Texas where this has happened, where it really didn't create that big of a problem, but the process is what's created a problem. And then you've got some places, and I'll bring up Euless, Texas, where it's a small municipality, and the majority of their property tax roll is multifamily developments, is coming off the tax roll. That's been happening with an HFC. Now there's been some other groups create HFCs and create a whole bunch of LLCs to really try to capitalize on this. Talfa, the HFC community, is not supportive of this. Anything that you do in the cloak of darkness to take something off the property tax roll and in another jurisdiction is not the right thing. We know this has the attention of the members of the legislature. We have been working with those members of the legislature to make sure they understand the history of HFCs and what they've done. And we will proudly work with those members of the legislature to stop the abuse that is happening. It is not right. If a cross-jurisdictional program exists after this legislative process, it will be one that exists with full disclosure and cooperation with that other entity. But Michael, the truth of the matter is, we're going to be there to protect the overarching program of HFCs. And we're going to have to try to deal with the fallout of what these HFCs that have abused this program have done. The legislature, by its very nature, is a reactive body. That's not a derogatory statement about the legislature. Most governmental entities are reactionary. And we have to make sure that we don't let the legislature overreact to what's going on. We are not supportive of what's gone on, but we also have a program that's been around since 1979 that has done great work, and we don't want to dilute or do away with that program. I can say from the member who has invested the most time in this issue, we were just together a couple of days ago, and he said, I want to reiterate, Todd, I do not want this program to go away. And I said, be more specific, what program? And he says, I don't want the HFCs to go away. I just want to make sure that we don't have people out there abusing the system.
sure.
And I said, well, we can stack hands on that all day long.
Has this been happening a lot. I know it's isolated, for lack of a better word, or it's just happening on a very minimal level. But has it been happening more as a result of the Public Facilities Corporation legislation? Then the PFCs are now limited to kind of their jurisdictional boundaries.
Yes.
Or some people getting into the HFC game and kind of
I think I think the uptick in activity has been a direct result of kind of the squashing of the opportunity through the PFC program. I think that's where we've really seen an uptick. If you track the number, now not to say that some of them that wasn't happening prior to, but this real uptick I do think is a result of what they did to the PFC statute last session.
And I think that just to add to that when they were dealing with public facilities corporations last session, it was through similar things, similar sort of exploitations or abuses of the tax exemption process. The PFCs were very broadly written into state code. There wasn't a whole lot of anything written about how to do them, monitor them, or to make sure they were transparent. And that's what we worked on last session. To Todd's credit, with what they're looking at this coming session, I think the legislature likes to see that the industry would police itself to want to correct for those things that would close those loopholes that they don't like to see.
Right.
And I have to agree that there was a lot of conflation that I saw where electeds or even appointed officials would conflate the issue of tax exemptions as it relates to PFCs to now tax exemptions as they relate to HFCs and potentially housing authorities as well. So from the TAP perspective, we want to be sure that they remain intact. We don't want to see any of these programs go away. There was a bill issued last session that could have been launched by Senator Betancourt that would have eliminated the program entirely.
Right.
And our goal is to maintain every tool in the toolbox for affordable housing that we can keep.
And I think these members like Senator Betancourt and they're smart. They're smart people. They recognize, though they might not like some of the particulars of these programs are important. So I think we're going to see very similar type of guardrails attempted to be put on, Chapter 394. And I think it'll be our job to go in collectively and say, we can live with this. This is a little bit tougher. And in my conversations with some of the members, back to my statement earlier, it's a math equation. So don't create a scenario. I'll use affordability as an example. Don't create the scenario where you require them to go so deep into affordability, the math just simply doesn't work anymore. And so it's going to be an exercise in education and advocacy, which is what our organizations exist for.
I remember that bill that Chairman Betancourt filed, and to his credit, I think it's a good negotiation tactic, if you will. Right? This is where I'm going to start eliminating the program. So I hope y'all are willing to work with me to
Fix this or else.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to get into a few quick policies again, and then we'll wrap things up with a couple questions. But I'm going to look back at last session, and a couple of these relate to single family, and so indulge me with your answers. But there were some bills that made significant progress, but just didn't quite cross the finish line. I'd be curious if you think they'll make more progress this session. The first is allowing accessory dwelling units on single family lots statewide. This came within one House vote of passing out of that chamber. Do you think this will be back?
I think it'll be back. How much progress it makes, I don't know. And that answer is based on the fact that we don't know what the House chamber is even going to look like.
Right.
You have so much change happening there that I think it's so hard to. Well, let me say it this way. I don't think I'm a good enough fortune teller to make any predictions to what the House is going to look like and how far some of these things are going to get. I think if you look at what happened last session, I think it's a very, very tough indicator as to what could happen this session, knowing that so many of the chess pieces are going to be moved around.
It gets back to educating, especially those freshman members.
Agreed.
What about minimum lot size? Kind of same prognostication for that.
I think that'll come back up, and I think it'll be a healthy discussion because I think it kind of fits into some of the things we were talking about earlier. That we can talk about those things, and I think they will kind of depending on who gets their hooks in it will determine how far the conversation goes. I mean, unfortunately, and I may be jumping ahead, Michael, but unfortunately, policy is driven by politics in this day and time. And so who chooses who for speaker, what side of the fence you're on this, has a lot to do with is that policy issue going to move forward. And I think that's the big disadvantage we're at right now is we just simply don't know who's going to be in favor with the leadership in order to move an item forward.
I should remind people who might be listening to this at a later time, we are recording this in mid-December,
Yeah.
while we still don't know who the speaker is going to be. But by the time that this gets out into the ether, we might have elected a
Okay.
speaker. But
Yeah, we're hoping.
yeah, exactly. There was a story recently about a proposed low-income housing tax credit community in San Antonio that got nixed thanks to a century-old valid petition law. There was a bill filed last session to address this, and there's been a ton of media coverage about what happened in San Antonio. And do you think this issue will return in light of what just
I
happened?
mean, my thought is yes. I think we'll see this come back, and I think that if there is a bill, this has to do with the fact that to go against a valid petition, you need a supermajority of the city council, basically meaning 3/4 of them have to all agree to go against a valid petition, and those valid petitions have managed to derail a lot of good housing developments, and that's really what the issue is at stake. I would say, from my membership's perspective, I'm pretty sure we would support anything that would limit or restructure how those supermajority requirements are set. So it came last session. I know it was there. I think we'll be paying a lot more attention to it this session because it's more than just a few developers that are impacted.
Yeah, I don't think the bill moved that much last session, but you've got all this media coverage on the heels of session, and people can be reactionary, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, couple fun questions. Let's say you're talking to somebody randomly, they know you work in advocacy, Todd, and they're curious about how to get involved, or even one of your members, whether it's a TALF or a TAP, and they come up to you and say, hey, I've been looking for ways to get involved in the legislative process. I don't really know how it works. I don't know when to show up. Maybe they just want to follow the process. Maybe they actually want to testify or advocate on the bill, whatever the case may be. What sort of advice do you give to them to get involved?
To start at the grassroots level. First, understand who your state rep and your state senator is. Introduce yourself to them. Help them to understand what you bring to their community. That's, at the end of the day, a member that walks into the legislature, their biggest concern is for their constituents, the people that can walk into a voting booth and vote for them. And that's, I don't think that's right or wrong. I just think that's natural. And so I think the best place to start your advocacy journey is with understanding you need to introduce yourself to those folks. I think if they want to take it to the next level, if they want to testify, I would tell them, let's come sit in some hearings. It doesn't need to be housing related. It needs to be about the process. Understand what type of testimony do members like to hear? What is, don't be controversial. Come learn and understand. The legislative process is just that. It's a process. It's not to be jumped in and out of. If you think you're going to be effective in the legislative process, and you think you can do that by getting engaged every other year for 140 days, you're just incorrect. You've got to be engaged every year, every month. It is a job. It's you got two things. You're either on the menu or you're at the table. And y'all have heard me say this 1,000 times. Be at the table. Be at the table. If government's in your business, be in the business of government. It's not a part-time job. And so if one wants to walk down that pathway, then hell, we have a PhD program for them. We can get them in. But it's something that at every level, start by understanding who your members are and introduce yourself to them. Because we are in the people business. Talking about policy, you're not talking to a machine. You're not talking to an AI-generated computer. You're talking to another human being that puts their pants on one leg at a time. And so understanding that this is more about communication with another person and how to do that effectively, that's going to get you a lot further down the road. And I think start that journey off in more of a successful manner.
It is a process, and one that you can't jump in and out of. You sound like my running coach during marathon training. It's like you can't just do this half the time. You gotta. This is a process. It's not going to be glamorous or sexy some of the times, but you got to do it. What advice would you give, Roger?
It's kind of the same thing. If somebody came and said, hey, I've been watching on the outside, I want to come in, help me out. I agree. It's like, in my case, I think I'd ask them if they're a member to join a committee that looks at legislative stuff. Learn how to hone your message. Learn how it all fits in the package of interest for the entire industry. And I would also add that it's important for one of the best valuable resources we could bring, and Todd alluded to this, is if we, for those of us who are at the legislature on a regular basis and understand the messaging, can bring a member of our industry in who is also a constituent. That's like having a little bit of gold in your pocket to say, because they will listen on two fronts. They will listen to the person there as the constituent and also the issue that they're bringing to the table that hopefully aligns with ours as an industry. So those are very valuable interests. We like to encourage them whenever we can, but they do have to have an idea of what they're getting into, because I know Todd's experienced this, and I have every once in a while where somebody will come in, they really have good in their heart to do, but they may get on the stand and say something that is not going to help the situation. And then it would require us to go and kind of correct the record to say what they really meant to say was this. And ultimately, we want to avoid those things. I'm not saying they shouldn't. They have perfect right to do so. We just like to be sure that they're doing it in the way they intend to do it, in an informed, constructive way.
Yeah, having one of your members who's a constituent testify, that is like having gold in your pocket. I always see how those legislators react whenever somebody's testifying, says, I'm from your district, and can start to relate to them. They start to perk up a little bit more. They get really interested, and those are so much more meaningful engagements.
Well, and even beyond that, Michael, because in Todd's world with Talfa and my world with TAP, it's not just where our owners and developers physically live. It's where their properties exist. And their properties exist all over the state of Texas. So they are, in a sense, constituencies in multiple jurisdictions.
Absolutely. We talked about Chairman Betancourt a couple times, that hearing that he just had. He's presided over a lot of housing hearings. And I watch all these, and there's always one thing that he asks, especially towards the end of committee hearings, that there are a lot of people testifying and they don't have much time. And he asks people to identify a single policy or a single piece of legislation that would be most helpful in bringing down the cost of housing. And I'm going to put you on the spot and pose that question to you. If you could wave your magic wand and pass one single policy or law that you think would meaningfully address housing affordability, what would it be? I'm not going to limit you to one. Let's say two. But we've all admitted that there's no silver bullet to this. But if you were to be put on the spot like that, what would you say?
Man, with what is in the purview of what a legislative body can do, I think it kind of goes back to, certainly if we could put some type of cap and restriction on the cost of goods, those types of things, lumber being the all-encompassing things, that's the most significant. I think removing, and I want to go back to Senator Betcourt's opening remarks in the last hearing that talks about if we can remove some of the barriers. Mm-hmm. I think that's it. I think removing state and local barriers. What requires me to bring a bunch of lawyers on board? What it requires me, the process of getting this deal done. I think if there's something that can be done, now, not to the extent that it cripples the deal, but I think that's the process is where they can do that. I think it's really tough, though, for a legislative body to come in and wave its wand on cost of production in this industry. I really do. Because where one cost is taken away, that cost, are you removing the cost? Are you removing the need for the cost? And I think that's two very different things. Because if you just remove the cost from me, you're going to shift it to Roger. But if you remove the need for the cost for either one of us, now I think we could be working towards lower cost to get something done.
So we need to get out of our own way.
We do need to get out of our own way.
What did you say?
Totally agree with that.
Okay.
My perspective is, if you think about it in these terms, it is hard. You can't just wave one magic wand. Money is money and time is money. And if the legislature, just like you said, getting out of our own way, if you could find ways to streamline duplicative or obsolete regulations, laws, that is money unto itself. And at the end of the day, affordable housing needs money to exist. So it's not going to happen in the market naturally in a way that we want. If we want good, high quality, affordable housing, it's going to require some level of subsidy, which means investment of time and or money. And that's what ultimately would work. So to that end, if you ask me one thing, I would say, you know what? A substantive funding of the state housing tax credit that you just endorsed would be a great way to get started.
Absolutely. Lastly, any bold predictions for the session about housing or anything in general?
Well, but the fact that we know nothing about nothing at this point,
You know,
We sit here, and as you said earlier, we sit here in the middle of December. For the first time, you have two members of the Texas House of Representatives declaring victory to be the speaker. I've not seen a speaker's, and you know, so who is the Speaker of the House is the business of the Texas House of Representatives. And I hold solid to that, and I'll always defend it because it's the vote of 150 people. That's it. You and I and Roger, we don't get to vote on that, but it has a big impact on us. I think that fact that you have two declared victors of who's going to hold that gavel in January, I think it's dividing the body. It's dividing the Republican Party, and I think amongst chaos and confusion, very little gets done. So whether it's a prediction or not, I think it's, if this goes to a big floor fight, I think that it's hard for these members to remove emotion out of this. It's hard to remove you were for me or you were against me.
Mhm.
And I think that will have a huge impact on what policy moves and how policy moves. And so I think that knowing that, I think it's important that those of us who are advocates understand that that doesn't mean that we do anything different. We continue to educate. We don't pick sides. We work with the folks who are there. And I think the prediction is if we do that, we will survive in a successful manner much longer than those who decide to get wrapped up in the emotion of what happens in that body.
I'd agree. I think that whatever happens with the speaker's race is going to be pervasive through the entire session. What that tells me is that if there is going to be any substantive legislative concepts, it's going to probably start in the Senate because they don't have nearly the new number of members, and their leadership is already set. So they kind of know the dynamics already. Who knows where this will end up? And you do need both chambers to make anything happen. So I would agree 100%. It'll be pervasive, so who you supported may totally impact, who carries a bill or gets a bill through the entire process. And that in itself can be its own obstruction down the line that we have no control over at the end of the day. To that end, bold, because they talked about affordability and affordable housing during interim sessions and interim charges, and it still is sort of percolating in issues, I would say we have a decent chance of getting a handful of good quality affordable housing bills through the process.
I like that note of optimism. Any final words, Todd?
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for being here. I really enjoyed this conversation. This one was multifamily focused. We'll have another one that's single family focused, but just thank you so much for your time.
It's our pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. We appreciate being here.